No, but like, one of the staffers in Jim Jordan's office.
It's like a big banana.
Yeah.
I know, which, but I'm just thinking something.
No, never mind. I'm wrong. That's not what it is. It's a nonprofit. It's
Chris, the others, like, they're with multiple.
Yeah.
It's like often I feel like I'm sort of like, you know, it's a paper suit. It's like, for Chris. Illinois, I think he's back and forth. Illinois right now. Yeah, what is it? What am I doing? Okay, Rachel.
All right, let's get started, and I'm just kind of checking the volume with this first few words. Seems okay? Great. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend today's briefing. U.S. birth rate trends, patterns, drivers and implications. I was like, oh, that doesn't sound right. Yes, it does. Birth rate trends, patterns, drivers, and implications for American families. I'm Dr. Jennifer Shuba, President and CEO of the Population Reference Bureau, and I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for this timely and important event. Today's event is sponsored by the Population Association of America, PAA, and PAA is grateful to the event's congressional sponsor, Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, whose office reserved the room and helped to promote it. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the PAA, it's a professional association comprised of over 3,000 population scientists, including demographers, sociologists, economists, epidemiologists, and at least one political scientist, that's me, who are conducting research on the individual, social, and environmental consequences of human population change that we're all really interested in. Population scientists, including today's panelists, rely on funding from the nation's scientific research agencies and data from federal statistical agencies to conduct the research and research training. The research featured in today's briefing underscores the integral role that, in particular, the National Institutes of Health and National Center for Health Statistics play in supporting population research. The topic of today's briefing is a great illustration of how population scientists inform contemporary policy issues and make significant contributions towards improving the nation's health and well-being. I'm joined on the panel today by two distinguished experts, Dr. Karen Benjamin Guzzo of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Dr. Melissa Carney, University of Notre Dame. Their complete bios are in your packet, so I won't read those. So a few housekeeping matters before we begin. The speakers' slides and bios and a recording of this event will be posted on the PAA homepage after today's event. And if you didn't get a packet, you will receive a link to all of the information in the briefing packets via email as long as you submitted an RSVP or signed in with someone to register. The speakers, including myself, are not here to advocate for particular policies, and any positions they or I might express are our own and don't necessarily reflect positions taken by the PAA. So the speakers are going to take no more than 15 minutes, and then I'll give a brief response, but move us to a question and answer. So as you have some questions, please keep those in mind, and I'll moderate that. And then during the Q&A, we will actually turn off the live stream so that you can feel free to ask questions and identify yourselves. So thank you for your attention, and I will now turn the platform over to Dr. Guzzo.
Right to the chase and get started, but thank you all for being here. I'm happy to talk about childbearing trends in the United States because these have been quite the hot topic over the past year or so. So I'll just start with this information here, which is about the total fertility rate. This is the number that you have probably seen in most media reports, that the total fertility rate has fallen to record lows. That is true. And so I'll explain here just for a second that I'm going to show numbers basically from 1990 onwards. We're looking about the past 35 years or so. And you can see here that we are at this in 2024, that's the most recent number we have, we are at a record low total fertility rate. The last time we saw anything close to being this low was in the 1970s, where we hit like 1.74 in 1976. What's interesting to think about though with the total fertility rate is that it's actually a misunderstood number in a lot of ways. It is not a real number in the sense that it is a prediction of how many children a woman will have over her lifetime. Instead, it's a hypothetical estimate that puts together birth rates at different age groups into kind of a nice packaged, easy to think about number. It's a hypothetical estimate. So it assumes that there will be no changes in birth rates at different ages in the future. So it assumes that today's 15-year-olds will have the birth rates of today's 25-year-olds, the birth rates of today's 35-year-olds, and the birth rates of today's 45-year-olds when they reach those ages in the future. And so we already know that birth rates are changing pretty dramatically at different ages. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that it's a hypothetical estimate. The other reason we hear a lot about the total fertility rate is because it's often put alongside what's called the replacement level of fertility, which is around 2.1. So we are at below replacement fertility. So replacement level fertility, though, is often something that's misunderstood a bit too. It is the hypothetical estimate of how many children a woman should have to replace herself and her partner. But it assumes that you have a closed population, that there's no immigration, that birth rates are staying stable at different ages, that life expectancy isn't changing. So it's not a real number either, but we often have these juxtaposed in the sense that we are below replacement fertility right now, and oh my God, that might mean population collapse is imminent. And that's actually not the case. So it's important to take a step back and really understand the numbers that we're looking at. The other thing I want to point out is that when you look at a hypothetical estimate like total fertility rate, you often miss that there's some good news behind the scenes here. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to teen birth rates and to birth rates in the early 20s. These have fallen pretty dramatically over the past 35 years. So compared to other high-income countries, the United States has had much, much higher teen birth rates. We've also had much higher rates of unplanned or unintended pregnancies and births, to the point that the United States has spent hundreds of millions of dollars and decades really on programming to reduce our teen and unintended fertility rate. And you can see here that we've been pretty successful. And in particular, you can see that since the Great Recession, these numbers have fallen pretty dramatically. And so this is typically a good news story in the sense that these are generally births that if they were to happen to a teenager or someone in their early 20s, they would themselves say, this is not the right time for me to have a baby. And so the decline in teen birth rates and the decline in unintended birth rates is a story that we should be celebrating, we should be happy about, because this is something we've actually worked hard to accomplish. Having said that, we've had this variation over time and we have continued to fall, but we are still at higher rates than some of our peer nations. The other thing is there's quite a lot of variation across the country. It is typically higher in places with lower levels of college graduates. So you can see along the coasts, and in New England, and then in sort of the upper Midwest, states that have really high levels of college graduates tend to have lower teen birth rates. So the good news is that a lot of the decline in the total fertility rate can be attributed to declines in teen births and to births to women in their early 20s. However, we're not seeing compensating increases in birth rates at older ages that would allow the total fertility rate to remain stable. So here's again, sort of the same numbers I just showed you, only I'm adding in that top line there, people in their late 20s. So that birth rate has declined as well over time, but not nearly as dramatically as it has for those in their teens. So just keep that in mind. And then here are birth rates for people 30 and over. And so the very top line there is women in their early 30s, the middle line is women in their late 30s, and the bottom two are women in their 40s. And so from 1990 till about the Great Recession, and the Great Recession really tends to be a kind of a real turning point for US fertility rates. Until the Great Recession, we saw rising birth rates for women in their 30s, but since the Great Recession, for birth rates for women in the early 30s, it has stayed relatively stable. For women in their late 30s, it's gone up a little bit. For women in their 40s, you can see the steady increase, but it's still at really low levels. So the compensation that we would hope to see to keep the total fertility rate stable has not happened at these older ages. And as a result, We are at a record high age at first birth in the United States. So this is the highest age recorded, in at least as far as back as we have records, to show that on average women are having their first birth in their late 20s, and men on average have their kids about 2 years later. And so we're seeing this dramatic increase, and it's particularly been steep in the years since the Great Recession. And like teen fertility, we see there is variation across states. Again, it is highest in those states that have higher levels of education. So people are spending more time getting degrees and less time, or waiting longer to have children. So as a result, we're seeing that birth rates are down among people in their 20s and younger, rising a little bit among people in their 30s and 40s, but not enough to compensate. And people in general are waiting longer to have children. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the total fertility rate is not a prediction of how many children a woman will have over her lifetime. So it doesn't tell me how many kids today's 15-year-olds will have. And instead, what we might look at is something called completed fertility. So we can figure out among people who have largely finished their childbearing years, how many children do they have? So this is not a hypothetical estimate. This is an actual number of children they have. So we're not, sort of guesstimating anything. So this is that total fertility line that I showed you before. And then here's information from the June current population survey. So this is a census product that is put out every 2 years, collected in June of even numbered years. And it simply says, how many children do you have? And it has asked of women of all ages, but in particular, I'm looking at women in their 40s, who are generally those who have largely completed their childbearing years. And you can see it tells a different story here. So on average, women are still completing their childbearing years with around 2 children. And that number has been much more stable over time than the total fertility rate has, because the total fertility rate gets biased when the ages at births are changing quite a bit. And just as a quick side note, the share of people who are childless hasn't increased dramatically over the past 30 years either. And so you can see here, it's gone up maybe a little bit. So this is at the end of the childbearing years. It's still, roughly, it's under 20% are ending their years childless. It's not a big change over time. Now, the share of people, as Dr. Carney will talk about, who are childless at younger ages has changed a bit, but that really reflects the changing profile of when people have kids. So this stability in completed fertility reflects the fact that norms have changed not that much. So we're often concerned that people don't want kids anymore, and there's maybe a little uptick in that, but it's not generally the case that people are saying they don't want children. So there's a number of different estimates that I could show you, but I'm just going to pull out one in the interest of time. So this is information from the Gallup, They do these polls every so often, and they say, what is the ideal number of children for a family to have? So this isn't how many children is ideal for you or you, but in general, what is ideal? And that has stayed, if not stable, in fact, increased a little bit over time. So the most common categories are people saying 2 or 3 children is the ideal number of children for a family to have. Among those who gave a numeric answer, and there's always been some variation, that's that orange stuff at the bottom, the orange bars at the bottom, of people who are like, I don't have an opinion, whatever people want. And there's always been some variation there, but on average, people are still saying, yes, having kids, and usually having 2 kids, is sort of a normative thing to do. So what I think is happening, and this is what my own research really suggests, is that declining fertility isn't driven primarily by people saying, nope, I don't want any children, or I only want one, I want to be one and done. That's not what's happening. Instead, as childbearing has become less compulsory over time, it is increasingly what you might think of as conditional. People want to have children and plan to have children if they have sort of all their proverbial ducks in a row. And I think this aligns with the fact that we actually spent decades trying to discourage people from having children under sort of the wrong circumstances. So now people think a lot about the economic circumstances and their relationships and so forth. And so when people don't find themselves in the right circumstances now or in the immediate future to have a child, they'll just say, not now. So these conditions for having children, they're exactly what you might think they are. They are having a good, stable relationship and partnership. And so we're seeing that people are waiting longer to get married, in part because they want to have finished their degrees, they want to have a good job, they want to have, they want to feel like they're adults and in a good state of mind. And so there are people who are waiting longer to get married, which people still, in fact, often still have children after they get married, not before. People want to have a stable and rewarding job. They want to make sure it is something that is reliable, so they, they're not just employed today, but they think they'll be employed in the future, that this is a career they can follow through on. But they also don't want to overwork. They don't want to work 60 or 70 or 80 hours because then they won't have time to spend with children either. They want financial security. They worry a lot, young adults today worry a lot about their student loan debt. They worry a lot about the cost of housing. The median age of buying a home in the United States is something like 40 these days. So they're really worried about kind of the cost of living, but they're also worried about the cost of direct parenting things. They want to know, can I afford childcare? And we know childcare is extremely expensive. They're worried that maybe they can't take some time off should they want to be at home with their children for a little while. They also are worried about their own sort of psychological well-being. Parents worry a lot about their children's mental health, but they also want to make sure that their own mental health is stable. They want to make sure that they are ready to be selfless and dedicated parents. So they're thinking about that a lot. And then increasingly over the past few years, they're also worried about whether they can get the kind of care they need during pregnancy. And in particular, if you already have a child and you're worried that having another child might be high risk for you, you have to weigh, can I get the kind of care I need that maybe puts me at risk of parenting the children I currently have? So when parents are worried about making sure that they're doing well for themselves, they're also worried about the future of their children's lives. And so, it is a cliche to say parenting is hard. It has always been hard, but I think it does seem harder than it used to be. Maybe it's because we're having more conversations about this with social media and blogging and so forth, but parenting is hard. So people are worried about their children's mental health, they're worried about bullying, they're worried about school violence. There's a lot that parents have to take into consideration. They're worried about screen time, they're worried about the health of their children, too many vaccines, not enough vaccines. There's a lot of things that are coming into play in their minds, and we've individualized this. There's a lot of burdens on parents to make these decisions. Young adults today are facing their own economic insecurity, and so they're really worried about their chances to give their kids economic security in the long run. They don't want to move back home with their parents as young adults themselves, and they want to be able to have children who they can launch and that won't come back. So they're worried about their kids' chances of, can they get a good job? What will the labor market look like? What will the housing market look like? Can I afford to send my kids to college? They're really worried about their kids' chances of getting ahead. So you don't have to read the Wall Street Journal to know that economic mobility is down across generations. And so parents are really worried about these things. They're also worried about sort of more existential crises. So we hear a lot that maybe young adults don't want to have children because of climate change. I would say that that's not a primary concern, but if you're already concerned about other things, you're concerned about the cost of living, you're concerned about the cost of childcare, you're concerned about your health during pregnancy, if you're already a little on the fence about having kids, worries about climate change might be sort of that extra thing that pushes you over. So it tends to be sort of a secondary concern, but it is something that people take into consideration. They're worried about political polarization. What kind of world will my kids grow up in? Will there always be fighting among different people? There'll be people who don't get along anymore, and we're worried about that. They're worried about the implications of the labor market and other forms of globalization. What kind of jobs will be around in the future, and where will those jobs be? We are having concerns about things like war, and there's been a lot of, again, the social media and the news media and the constant sort of talk about all the events going on does make it hard to feel secure about the future. And of course, we just lived through the pandemic. People still consider concerns about, what if that happens again? Could I be able to raise my children the way I would want to? So they can continue to think about ongoing health threats. And so they're worried about these kind of general things. So they're worried about the short term, the long term, and these kind of existential crises. And so having kids is essentially about making a commitment to the future. So you are a parent not just for 18 years, but you're a parent forever. You're a parent in the next 20, 25, 30 years, you're a parent forever. And so if you're worried about whether the future looks good for you, then you're going to be really worried about whether the future looks good for your children, your potential children. And so what's probably happening is people don't feel very confident about their futures. And so what they're doing is they're making a series of not now decisions. It's not that they're saying, nope, at age 20 I'm not having kids and I'm sticking to it. They're saying, not now, maybe in the future. And for some people, they'll make that decision, that delayed decision over and over again, and they end up having fewer children than they would have liked, and while others will end up having no children at all because they were unable to reach the circumstances that they felt confident in which they could have children. So with that, I'm right at time. Yay.
so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting this, and it's great to follow that presentation because I get to piggyback off the very clear description of what the total fertility rate is, so I won't have to go into that. But what I want to do is spend the first few minutes of my time putting what's gone on in the US into a more international context. So with all of the caveats about the total fertility rate notwithstanding, what I'm showing you here is that the fall in the TFR in the US is not a unique phenomenon. And in fact, what's happened in the US is we've somewhat belatedly come to the lower level of fertility that has been happening in other high-income countries for a while. I think that matters a lot when we think about what might be driving these trends, to realize that this is not a US-specific phenomenon. In fact, it's quite interesting when you look at this longer-term picture of the TFR. I'm pulling out a set of OECD countries here, not randomly. These are countries that I have a lot of cohort data on. I'm going to show you in a minute. But if I just compare this to the European Union, for instance, it would look the same. The idea is after all of the changes in the 60s and 70s when fertility rates fell, all across the high-income world, basically, the US sort of stabilized at a TFR above 2. In some sense, we were quite extraordinary that women in the US kept having this number of children. And so maybe it shouldn't be as surprising as it seems to be in the past few years that we've fallen down to the 1.6 number that was highlighted. But it's really this post-Great Recession, again, trend that is capturing attention. If I look at this in a cohort sense, this moves us away from some of the problems of the TFR as a hypothetical approximation. So what I'm showing you here is age-specific fertility across different birth cohorts of women for a set of high-income countries for which we can get this data from the human database. Okay, and so what I'm showing you, let's focus on the United States here. As you move cohorts, so the top line, the orange line, are women born in the 1970s, and then in 5-year birth cohorts, down to women born and this is in the 1990s. Okay, 1995 is the middle year there. So what you see is at each age, women are having fewer children. Okay, so this is really important because this allows us to see the delay and what it's turning into. So women are delaying, but in the most recent cohorts, what we're seeing is that by their 30s, they're not catching up. So if I just focus on the youngest women, these women who are 25, or these women who are 30, we see that there's still a substantial gap between the age 25 and age 30 completed fertility, children ever born, of the immediately preceding cohorts. So here's where we all have to have humility. We don't really know what's going to happen. But if we look at these women who are age 25 and age 30, they would have to have unprecedented high rates of fertility in the later part of their childbearing years in order to catch up with the completed fertility of women who are now in their 50s and 40s, okay? And that is, again, that's not specific to the US. We're seeing that across other high-income countries. This does appear to be driven by an increase in childlessness at all ages. So again, I'll focus on the US and highlighting these things, but what you can see is what is the probability that a woman is childless at any given age? It's, here it is. So what you can see is for women today who are 30, half of them have never had a child. So that's much higher than it was in previous generations. And so for the childlessness rate to fall down to like the 15%, roughly 15% rate that it was for women, again, in their late 40s, 50s who are now done with childbearing, it needs to be the case that 40% of women who are currently childless at age 30 will have to have a child in order for those childlessness rates to converge. Again, anything can happen. We have to have a lot of humility when we're trying to think about what's going to happen to fertility rates. But this is really important because if you look at like the Social Security actuarial reports, they're assuming that basically women are just going to get on previous trends. When I look at these trends by age across cohorts, I'm seeing no data-based reason to make those kinds of assumptions. Okay, so why is this happening? I have a bit of a similar but nuanced different interpretation than what we just heard. So first, let me start with period-specific economic conditions and policy conditions. The fact that this is really universal, I haven't shown you the data in the US, but this is sort of happening across all groups in the US. I also showed you it's sort of happening across, well, it is happening across all high-income countries. The explanation for why this is happening is probably not US specific. So things like, well, it's, you know, really expensive to have kids in the US. Maybe it's extra expensive, but actually what we know is nothing changed dramatically in 2007 that would have predicted a sustained decrease in birth rates. So the surprise here is not that birth rates fell during the Great Recession, it's that they never recovered. So excluding the Great Recession, which was a big event and we would have expected a dip, what else has happened post sort of 2010 that can explain this? And when you look in the data at different economic and policy explanations in sort of a period-specific way, we can't find any. By we, I mean co-authors and I who have looked at this. So all I'm showing you here is 3 examples. If you look at how about places where child care costs increased by more, birth rates did not fall by more. In fact, the line is going in the wrong direction. Places where female to male wages went up by more, birth rates did not fall by more. In fact, it's going in the wrong direction. Places where per capita student loan debt went up by more, there's no relationship with birth rates. So that really leads us to think about, okay, maybe it's not so much about what's happening in these years, but what's happening to the cohorts, the people who are entering the childbearing years in those later years. So what we conclude, by we I mean Phil Levine and I who have worked on this together for a long time, what we conclude is that it's really probably a complex mix of factors that are all sort of, you know, happening across high-income countries to various degrees, affecting different groups in those high-income countries to varying degrees, but sort of pushing towards this low fertility social equilibrium. So to be very specific about what I mean, we refer to it, for lack of a better term, as shifting priorities, and propose that it likely reflects a complex mix of changing norms, evolving economic opportunities and constraints, and broader social and cultural forces. Let me just put that into a visual for you. Okay, so if you have 20s and 30-year-olds deciding, how am I going to prioritize my time and money and my resources in my 20s and 30s, the major life decisions people are making are about how much effort to put into starting a family, getting married and having kids, how much to put into investing in my career, or how much to spend taking leisure time, right? Travel, or if you want to have less expensive leisure, watching video games, all these things that we know that young adults are spending sort of more time and money doing than previous cohorts that are really alternatives to parenthood, at least at that time in life. So the way that people make these choices of how to prioritize their time and resources in their 20s and 30s reflects parenting norms. We just heard a lot about the worry of parenting. We have lots of data showing that parenting has just gotten a lot more intense. So the people who sort of grew up experiencing childhood in the 70s and 80s, parenting didn't look that hard, right? Your kid ran around in the backyard. People who grew up in the 90s, early 2000s, you were more likely to see your mom working too, and schedules getting really intense, and it getting really hard to get into schools, and what parenting means just looks, it's more intense, right, in a very real way. So that too affects sort of the relative value or choices of these alternatives, and also how much you think you have to have everything in order before you embark on that commitment. Gender role norms, how much do people expect men and women in a home to jointly share in household or childcare, right? Those things affect the choices people are making. Leisure norms and work norms. People have written about greedy jobs. As work becomes more demanding, in a world where parenting is more demanding, parenting and work are more likely to be in conflict, okay? And all of these norms are set by economic opportunities and constraints. If there's more economic uncertainty, if inequality is higher, you might, there's more pressure to excel at work. That affects how you prioritize your time investment. And there's cultural forces, media. The more media celebrates alternative lifestyles to parenthood, that affects the choices people are making. We know there's been a decline in religious observance participation. That affects the way people are making their decisions. It's very hard to quantify in the data the role of these sort of universal trends, okay? But this is the way we're thinking about it, in part because the things that are really easier to quantify in the data are just not showing up as very, explaining much at all the variation or what's happening. All right, so why does this matter? I'll just throw out some ideas that I've thought a lot about. The first, let me point to the fact that, again, as was already established, people are not in surveys largely saying that they don't want kids anymore. I think that's really important because if what we saw in data was that there was a large scale move away from a like 2-family ideal, then we should have a different conversation. The conversation should be, look, now that people have more choices, people don't want to have kids. And so how do we build an economy or a society that works in that world? If people still say in an ideal way that they would like to have these, 2 or 3 children, and that's not what we see people doing, then it's a different question because it's not clear that people are maximizing or having as great welfare, well-being as they could have. If constraints were somehow relaxed and people could feel like they could have more, then, well, it makes it easier to fund Social Security, but it also means people are happier, right? So the fact that we're not seeing large-scale responses in surveys that people just don't want to have children or the 2-child family is not ideal anymore, that gives me pause about sort of being complacent about this. Now, as an economist, I also think very much about whatever normative, whatever we think people want or not, if it makes people happy or not, we do have real challenges for society and the economy if we're dealing with a shrinking population or an aging population that we'd be foolish not to try and get ahead of ourselves on. So what do I mean? Well, everyone in this room knows this sort of, inverted age pyramid, population pyramid, puts fiscal pressures on social insurance programs. Social Security and Medicare were not created with an eye towards having 2.3 workers per retiree. And so it makes the imperative of addressing the design of those programs that much greater. You will have shrinking communities. We already see this in places, in localities where birth rates are down. Localities and states, they have to figure out, how do we close schools? How do we close hospitals? How do we fund necessary public goods with a shrinking tax base? That's a very real, that's probably the most immediate challenge. And then the evidence from economics suggests that aging workforces, shrinking workforces are less dynamic, less innovative. And so that's something we should be thinking about. And in a broader sense, of course, there's the worry for secular stagnation. Now, I want to be clear, demographics does not have to be destiny. But demographic headwinds are real when it comes to economic dynamism and economic growth. And again, we should want to get ahead of those trends. All right, so what can be done in my remaining 3 minutes? The first, I want to be clear. The answer to this, if you think, okay, declining birth rates are a problem, what would it mean to be a society that had higher birth rates? We have to move away from an old school model where basically societies were choosing, or families were choosing, high levels of female labor force participation versus fertility. What I'm showing you here is that across high income countries, a majority of women now work. Okay, so in the US, 80% of women of childbearing age work. Everywhere it's above 60%. Israel and South Korea are an outlier in all these figures. And that's important to keep in mind because sometimes I think we draw too much from those 2 examples, depending on which point you want to make. Someone's going to tell you about South Korea or someone's going to want to tell you about Israel. They are always outliers. So in Israel, you have very high rates of female labor force participation and very high rates of fertility. In South Korea, you're on the lower end of both, okay? But this is the point, is we should be thinking about these issues in a modern economy, society, recognizing that women work. Having said that, the challenge here is not just, it's not going to be easy or incremental. If we want to make parenthood and work more compatible, it's not going to be solved by, let's say, an additional 6 or 12 weeks of paid maternity leave, right? So what I'm showing you here is what economists have unfortunately and misleadingly in my mind labeled the child penalty. What that is in the literature is the reduction in earnings that mothers experience, okay? So a woman gives birth, and then subsequently, compared to women who don't give birth or to men, her earnings fall. We don't really know if it's because of pressures from the workforce or because she's choosing to stay home, we just know that they fall. So an obvious policy response is we have to make it easier for women to maintain their earnings with paid leave or with childcare, et cetera. What I'm showing you here is that across countries, there is precisely 0 relationship between that, what's called a penalty, and fertility rates. So in Norway, where there's lots of family-friendly policies, or in Korea, where there's not, you're still not seeing, fertility rates close to 2. That just means that this is not an incremental or easy policy challenge. All right, so what do I take away from the evidence as I read it? If the goal is to increase fertility, Not because we want to convince anyone who doesn't want to have children, but because there are people who are saying my ideal family size is 2 and I'm not getting there. If we want to make sort of society or the economy feel more, pro-family, we could potentially think about increased access to home ownership. There's some evidence that it's not just about reducing the cost of housing, it's actually home ownership. A recent, academic paper that I had with a co-author shows that the GI Bill and that low down payment mortgage that was created in the 30s and 40s seems to have really contributed or set the stage for the baby boom. We could think about more flexible careers and schedules, but again, it's not just going to be about incremental policy changes. We could think about ways of making parenting less intense, and we could think about potentially much more income support to parents. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Right, thank you so much to both of you for that. I am gonna make sure that we have lots of good time for questions, but wanted to just put up here real quickly, we have a resource at PRB that's kind of like frequently asked questions about this, where we link to researchers like Melissa, Karen, and others. And so if there's no way we're gonna have a chance to get to all of the questions today, and so some of them may be answered in this resource that we have there. And it's also it's a living document, which we will keep updating with these frequently asked questions, so feel free to refer to it at any time. I was just gonna bring together a few of the things in summary, and so be thinking of your questions as I do that. I think one is that policymakers and social scientists have something really important in common, which is that we both desperately want to boil down the reasons for something like low fertility to 1 to 2 factors. We want to boil it down as social scientists so that we can get that next peer-reviewed journal article, and we say this variable has the most explanatory power, and then we will put it in the title of our argument. And then decision makers want that because they see those as policy levers. Like, I know it's complicated, so give me the 1 or 2 things so that I can then go and have an impact and say, all right, we're gonna do a bill on this. But I think what we learned from both of these is that this is a fool's errand when it comes to the question about low fertility. There are many important factors. And in fact, if they had more time, and I know this because I've read their work and work of colleagues of theirs, when you really get down to the fact that these are individual decisions, we know that the constellation of importance changes over time for us. Like how I might have felt at 28, I felt quite different at 33 and then into my 40s and so on. And so those things can be really hard to capture, which is really frustrating from a policy standpoint and also from a social science standpoint. And I think that's another takeaway in this vein, is that those big numbers that we see, whether it's a growth rate or total fertility rate or how many constituents you have, these are aggregations of individual decisions, and it just becomes very hard for us then to think about doing something about those. Another theme that I think arises is about the upsides to low fertility rates. And so this also was a question that was sent to us ahead of time, and something that I wanted to mention here. So the question was, can't we just let these things fall, and won't it be great because then these housing pressures that we know people face, those will be alleviated, or the environment will be cleaner, and these other issues that we have about climate, those all change. And I think what we learned from both Melissa and Karen is that, again, it's a complicated answer. So on the one hand, we saw that there were some actual upsides reflected in the fact that people who maybe didn't want to have kids, they're not having them so much anymore. And when you think about poverty and trying to tackle that, trying to help take care of someone in their lifetime when they haven't been wanted, then we could think about that as perhaps a good thing. There are always ethical arguments to come into place there, but lower teen pregnancy rates, lower unintended pregnancy rates, that in itself seems good, unless you get to a point, perhaps a tipping point, where the numbers about fertility reflect larger societal dynamics that we actually would, as a society, want to address. So I think that is something that they both got to as well. If we're having fewer than we say we want, does that then become a problem for policy to solve? And so I think when you're trying to address an issue like low fertility, one of our challenges is which aspect of this is a problem we are trying to solve in policy or just interesting? And I think what they point to is that perhaps that gap between the number of children people say that they want to have and the number they're actually having could be a place where policy could come in. We do also know that research about the relationship with the environment is mixed. We see both that it ends up cleaner environments in some places that have depopulation. There's research on Japan that shows that humans have had such an intimate relationship with the environment for 2,000 years that when they depopulate, you see species decline. So we see both of these things happening, and I would say, lots more research needed on that. Just to understand the ways in which it changes the environment, right? So not a big blanket question like, is it good, but in what ways does it change this? And I think that's what you're gonna find as we go forward. In many ways, as you'll see from the charts and graphs, we're in uncharted territory. There are places in the world, there are times in history where we've seen blips of this, but this kind of sustained, long-term, cross-national, cross-income, cross-race trends, this is new. And so anytime we have uncharted territory, there's a lot of room for fear and for conjecture. And what we're really trying to do is find where we have the data to support our assumptions. And that's why being able to support researchers like Melissa and Karen is incredibly important. Okay, leaving some time for some questions here. I actually wanted to tee one up, if I could, which is to think about inequalities in access. And so we know that while I just said fertility decline as a big brushstroke trend is across populations, when we really start to drill down, we do see some differences by income, race, education, marital status, etc. So, but to you, what disparities stand out the most? Is it by geography or race or something else? And what should Congress know about those divides?
Sure.
Make sure that's on.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that question and thank you for that nice summary. So what I would say, what I am increasingly worried about are sort of the fertility haves and have-nots. So we know that people with a college degree get married later and have kids later, but people without a college degree are decreasingly likely to get married, which might mean they're decreasingly likely to have children, but they're not saying they want fewer children. So we want to make sure that we are that those who have sort of been left behind by our economy as we move to more professional organizations, professional jobs and so forth, that those people have opportunities to still achieve the basic prerequisites for marriage and childbearing. So that's something that I worry about a lot, that we're gonna have the fertility haves and have-nots, and that only some people will get to fulfill their own personal desires for childbearing.
I agree with that 100%, and I think that's, I'm not sure how many people think that actually, so this is a big point in the sense I think for so many years, I mean, I think if you asked me that question on a panel like 10 years ago, and perhaps you too, I don't want to speak for you, it's like, I would have been concerned about like access to Medicaid and that kind of thing. If we expanded Medicaid family planning services, and really worried, I spent the first 10 years of my career worried about high rates of teen childbearing, which was especially high among vulnerable populations. It is still true now that higher educated, higher income women have fewer children on average, but those gaps have fallen, again, as Karen was saying. I do worry also that sort of marriage and having kids is becoming a bit of a luxury good in a way that I think, most of us wouldn't be happy about.
Okay. How many, let me take a temperature of how many questions there might be from you all, because I came with a huge list of things. Okay, all right. I'll go to your question and then I can ask some more. Thanks. Yeah, please.
All right,